say that I'm really happy to be here. It is an honor to be able to come and talk at the Economic Research Service to share the work that we've been engaged with in large part because of support from USDA's Economic Research Service. And yet we also have to recognize that this is really a broad group of agencies that are funding it, and so we're happy to acknowledge their work. Many thanks to Maddie from CBEAR to organizing these three and working closely with Dan Hellerstein here at ERS, and Mark, and thank you for broadcasting it broadly amongst the community of researchers here. So thank you for that. What I'm going to be specifically mentioning today, and that is, this is the third of three talks. So I want to build upon the great work that Paul and Leah Palm-Forrester have done in their previous talks. And you can go on to CBEAR's website and you can get this on their videos. But let me give you the 10-second nutshell of it, right? So Paul really pushed us all to think about the importance of power analysis, to be realizing that a lot of the studies that we're looking at in the experimental economics and even the observational data are underpowered, and the challenges that comes in being able to make a reliable, having reliable results underneath it. So Paul pushed us there and talked a lot about the active research that's going on. Leah talked about the importance of thinking about the literature and what we know, and one of the things you walk away from Leah's talk was there is an enormous number of gaps in this literature, thinking about using experiments and behavioral insights. And one of the key things why we think that's important is most of the behavioral nudge work has always been in the private good domain, with consumers making choices perhaps on food or retirement savings, perhaps on organ donation, and a lot of other kind of individual choices that are private goods. And yet if we think about things in the agri-environmental context, we're really talking about producers who are really trying to profit maximize and making some large-scale choices on their landscape and on their farms. And often these are quasi-public good components too, where there's some environmental benefits that accrue to the public as well as private on the land. So it is important to fill those gaps. And I guess I would say my is, okay, so Paul talked about how to do this right and how to do it well. Boy, there is a lot of work that needs to be done in this domain, and I'm going to say, let's learn from what the lessons from what's happened already. And so I'm going to try to come with a and say, unlike other academics who walk in and say, hey, I've just created the greatest new research result ever, I might have stumbled in this process. I will try to talk about things that we didn't do well or we didn't expect and that caused challenges. I'm going to try to repair my ego at the end by saying that we did learn something. This was came as well, but hopefully we can begin to learn about it, because ultimately these types of field experiments and randomized controlled trials are going to be what we need for are well suited for evidence-based policy in this domain. So I threw up the old picture of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and probably we'll be talking about that in a variety of contexts, but yeah, there'll be a little bit of ugly today. So one of the things I want to be building upon is what we call the CBEAR sandbox, right? These are a lot of field experiments that we're doing with a variety of different people around the country. You can see just a spattering of stuff that we're doing that's by county in various parts of the country, and some of them are really looking at consumers, other are looking at farmer producers, some are looking at household decision making, and I'll kind of go into that point. So I apologize if I seem to be bouncing from spot to spot to spot, but hopefully we can get into the details of any individual study that you would like, but hopefully there's a broader picture that I can paint by the end of it. So let's talk about, make sure we're all on the same page on what a field experiment is, right? And ultimately why we want to use these is because if we think about challenges in the agri-environmental situation, they come here, right? So if we're trying to change things, get better outcomes, we're going to need to begin to look at human behavioral change. And field experiments allow us to really measure that change and understand what affects change and how can we influence it, and that can be really helpful in an evidence-based policy situation where we can think about asking questions. Well, how do we get farmers to do more on water, water conservation, or how do we have people do more crops to improve water quality? What are the issues about how to protect certain wildlife on agricultural lands? So we ask these questions. How do we test these things formally? How do we have really good A/B choices, or how do we have really clear counterfactuals in our designs? How do we learn from this and then hopefully adapt, right? And that's the things that CBEAR constantly talks about when working with USDA program administrators and others in this domain is, let's make sure this is a full loop, that we continue to ask questions, learn, adapt, and have better programs forward. So certainly bipartisan in that goal of using taxpayer money wisely in this situation. And I think there's this kind of dual purpose that it's really these field experiments are attractive to academic journals, and so it helps researchers to be engaged in this issues, and yet they're also, I think, make a lot of sense for policymakers as well in trying to understand what works and what's not. I'm going to introduce the main piece by this three-dimensional diagram that I worked on with Lori Lynch when she was here at and Josh Duke as well, and go through at least how I see some of the major challenges of this work are, and a little bit of the history of experimental economics. The experimental economics world really kind of starts here in the lower right-hand side of this picture, where we say have control, right? We really need to be able to have experimental control to understand why people do things. And if we could use that kind of lab control that we see the natural scientists doing, wouldn't that be great? And couldn't we test our theories well? Couldn't we isolate certain behavioral elements and be better off? And so the first efforts really brought in the most convenient of all samples, our students that were at our various research institutions, and we could bring up labs and look at that. But this diagram kind of inherently talks about some of the challenges of what it doesn't do very well, right? We often don't have very much context. That's in option A versus option B, and one option A is more risky than option B. We're not talking about things of water quality or environmental conservation, wildlife protection. Likewise, we're not getting too high up in the representativeness piece of things, right? We're not seeing that these people are typical farmers. We're going to be seeing them as that, quite young, quite inexperienced in life, maybe higher income, higher education than average. So that's sort of where we go. And why do we even want to think about it? What is the reason why we want to use students? Well, if we think about our basic economic theory, in general, that's okay. We don't assume that our economic theory base is different based on age or cultural background or level of education, experience, gender, all these things that might actually be influencing behavior. But our theory generally stays pretty agnostic around this. And so we assume that if it works for students, why wouldn't it work for farmers, right? And so if we're testing a theory, there's this kind of natural logic that we didn't say that this was only relevant to people with lots of experience in this area or training. Of course, there's an access issue that's just great, right? I can just send out an email blast to my students or to my college, and I can get people cheaper, quicker. Universities have these computers labs set up that we can, and we're paying. It's just cheap, right? So we can get a pretty high wage. It'll be $20 to $25 an hour for a student. That brings them in pretty quickly. They're also really good at computers. They can learn. But the question is that valuable from a policy perspective? In fact, I want to give a shout out for Stephanie Roche's work here at ERS and colleagues that are all working on a white paper right now that OMB has requested to look at to what degree can we look and extrapolate from students, right? I think, Dan, you call these, if we're doing, cancer research and we're testing out new things, we might want to use lab rats, right? And see, does this work? And is this a good spot to look at? To then be able to to do more clinical trials in other contexts? Are these okay as well? Can we say that this is an acceptable spot for us to do some initial evaluations for in students and go from it there? And likewise, Stephanie and the team are also looking at the level of incentives that matter, right? You have to offer a lot of money to these students or other contexts, or just a little bit of money goes a long way, or maybe even if it's a hypothetical, you get pretty much the same results. So again, look for those results coming forward in those two white papers. And one of the first things that you start seeing as people think about agri-environmental context is, well, why are we giving choices between option, account A and B into it? Why don't we talk about that? Account A is really about investing in individual farm and its production, and maybe option B is some type of best management practice that's being put on it that helps environmental quality but lowers maybe your individual private return from your farm. So you start moving into more context. I'm going to talk about non-point source pollution. I'm going to be talking about protecting. Now, I'm not actually doing it, but at least I'm bringing context in, because maybe those kind of values matter. And again, those things are nice in terms of control and maybe push up context by the framing of it, but you're still really low on the representativeness category. And I think of when I think about the objections that one hears over and over again, I feel like it's captured in this picture, right? And this was from my lab. These are some of my students, and you can just almost see all of those concerns showing up right there. That even if you want to have the most, as soon as you start talking about a student subject in a lab, you start thinking, well, boy, they look too young. They might not be representative of the farmer population in the country. Look like they're having too much fun, right? They might be communicating in ways we don't know. They might be, looking at each other's screens. This doesn't seem like where we want to be basing US $6 billion of agri-environmental payments based on results from these two. And maybe I feel a little bit better about this picture, right? So this is again an experiment that we ran in the state of Delaware involving farmers, and boy, this like, oh yeah, this feels okay, right? Maybe this feels like I've got some adults who are making serious decisions, right? They're giving thoughtful contemplation of the decisions. I've got some different backgrounds of people, and I can tell lots of stories from these pictures. And so it's having submitted enough articles and then kind of getting a rejection, like, well, you got to go and have some more representative samples. I just think it makes sense if you're trying to convey to a policymaker why they should trust these results. A picture like this, I believe, can go a long way, and that's kind of what you see in this picture that Lori and Josh and I worked on, is this green area, right? How do we push that up, right? So we still like control. We think context matters too in agri-environmental, but how do we move us into more those 9 and 8 going there? And as soon as when I thought about where do I fail as a researcher most often, I don't really fail too much under control. I don't really fail too much under context. Where the big challenge for us is that green, that representativeness, and I think that is still a frontier that we have a long way to go. And so that's what I'm going to continue to talk about. And let me summarize a little bit about the financial realities there, right? So Paul, when he was here, talked about, boy, we have underpowered studies, right? A power study should be at a minimum of 80% power, and yet the average ones that are coming out are 18%, right? That was a recent peer-reviewed article. So we're finding ourselves underpowered. We've got to get more and more people to do these studies, or as Colin Weigel was talking about, bigger impacts, right? So you can see these things, properly designed studies, and yet as we think about getting larger and larger sample size, we recognize the costs keep going up. And I remember being at a talk at AAEA with John List, was giving a keynote address several years ago, and And as he talked, I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to be in a situation where it's increasingly expensive to do this research, and there's some challenges with getting young people involved in that, and how do we grow a field that is so expensive to do? And this gives you some sense of what we're talking about. So if I'm talking $15 to $25 an hour subjects to do the adult subjects that are just from the population, I'm talking $25 to $40. I know some people pay up to $100 an hour if they're getting kind of professionally recruited. Now, by the time I'm talking about getting a farmer into a frame field experiment, maybe it's $100 an hour. But there's this really tantalizing number there, which is what CBEAR thinks a lot about, which is that if we could just embed these designs inside of a program, we would be at the top of representativeness, top of control, top of context, and the cost goes, very, very small. And that may be why we want to think about these administrative data working with programs. And so, that kind of gives you the kind of the holy grail along with your gold standard and all these other type of positive names I could give it. But it assumes that these numbers are even right, that we can get people in for this amount, or at least a representative group. And I think that's part of the challenge. So one of the things that we've been doing as part of CBEAR and at the University of Delaware is really trying to get away from student participants. Just the external validity is so important, and therefore we got to get as representative samples as possible. We don't want just student, staff, faculty at universities. We want to get out into the public, and so we've got a little vehicle that drives around, allows us to do mobile, allows us to have on-site electricity, and festivals. I'm always looking for people, places where adults are hanging out and are bored, right? So ferry lines, right? So they're waiting between the New Jersey-Delaware ferry, and they're sitting in their cars for 45 minutes for the next ferry. Well, they're pretty open to that. Going to other spots we've looked at, going to the Department of Motor Vehicles can often be a spot where people have a little bit of time on their hands. You're getting a much better representative sample. And maybe you can get people that are there. I think of like parents at a swim meet or a crew regatta or something where they're just waiting for their kid to actually do something, but they might be spending a lot of time. If we could intercept them at there, festivals perhaps are good. We've done some things at beaches, and that's a terrible place to do it, right? Because we did this once on Rehoboth Beach in Delaware, and people would come and we'd intercept and say, can you give us 20 minutes to do a study? They say, no, I'm too busy. And of course, what do? They walked 10 feet down the beach, they plopped down on the sand and and laid there for 5 hours in front of my researchers. Well, my researchers were like, what do you mean you didn't have 20 minutes? But of course, it's their vacation, it's their summer vacation. It's a high value to spend that time at the beach. So you got to find the right moments. And these are just some examples of where we've been able to do things and had various success and trying to get different people there. And and we've been able to get a lot of, for food studies that have agri-environmental impacts, we can get studies of up to 4,000 people, right? Maybe over different locations, different studies. We can begin that kind of power that we've been hoping for in our studies. And so, that's when I think about consumer studies, and let me give you an example. We've been working with this project called Conserve. It's a NIFA-funded project that looks at food, and specifically food that's been irrigated with non-traditional water sources, right? So this could help a lot with water problems out west. And the concern is whether or not people, would actually eat this food if they knew about it. What would the labeling look like? And so, in terms of our representativeness, we can get pretty close. All we got to get is adult consumers. Maybe we set the age at 21. We make sure they're not allergic to the food, so we're not, they're somewhat interested in doing this. And if we design something relatively quickly, maybe it takes 10 to 15 minutes. We did this study actually in DC and Arizona, and actually replicated it in Israel, and we were able to do kind of these short type of intercept experiments in which people could have a very simple choice, right? So here's a bag of carrots. It says it's been done it's been produced with conventional water, and 86 for it, right? I mean, this is almost like a choice experiment, except that we're actually using the carrots on site. We're using the real money. Yes, no. You know, we can translate this into the Hebrew and do it pretty simply and look at dates in that context for clementines. We can change the prices. We can change the information. We can do all that type of experimental variation, and one can do it relatively quick. And again, you know, part of the benefits of doing that is you can find some interesting results. And I could talk all the time about these studies, so I'm just going to give you a snippet. But you know, here's just like a quick taste of some work of what we've done, and that looks at, okay, well, consumers, if they're paying for food, you know, that is from conventional water, maybe it's clementines or something like that, they're willing to pay $2.50 for it. However, when you start talking about being a non-traditional water, maybe this is recycled sewer water, maybe this is produced water, right, that comes from oil and fracking industries. Well, the price drops down dramatically compared to in Israel. Well, look, here's a place that's been actually using recycled sewer water for 30 years to solve a lot of its water challenges by using this water in agriculture. There hasn't been dramatic health impacts. They still, even in Israel, were concerned about it, but that drop in willingness to pay wasn't nearly as dramatic as it was in the United States. And so then we can say, well, you know, imagine there's endless things that we can look at, like why do the Israelis care about it? Was it a bigger problem that they knew this was solving? Did they just have better experience with it? Did they have different information sets? Again, you can tease this out, and from a, you know, you can imagine there's lots and lots of interesting studies that could happen from that. And so when I think about consumer studies, I'm not too worried about the issues that Paul raised about having high sample sizes to be able to detect effects, and we're okay there. But let's think about households a bit, and I'll tell you a little story. Here's a project that we worked on. We call it HomeVise, Homeowner Values Innovation Stewardship Enhancement Project. It's one of those box projects that I mentioned. And we said, you know what, we're going to be working on bringing in homeowners, or at least people who have choices on their landscape. We'd like to know how could they make better choices, doing things like plants or soil augmentations like biochar or peat moss. Could they use a soaker hose to be more water conservation oriented, or just even test their nutrients? Do they even need to be putting fertilizer on it? And we said, okay, we're going to design this. We're going to have, you know, we'd like to have this online. And, you know, we went out and got a firm called Info Group that had all these emails. We said we want them to be in Delaware. And so we got 5,000 residents of Delaware. And, you know, we didn't pay a lot, $650. But, you know, what happened, right? Well, we got 4 people who participated after 2 weeks, or a booming response rate of 0.28%, right? That's pretty bad. Even worse is none of them reported living in Delaware. And so, you know, then we had to go back and say, well, you know, Delaware is a little small. We decided that we didn't follow your rules. We decided to make it, you know, within 25 miles of Delaware. Well, that's great. Well, 25 miles of Delaware, that's everywhere. You know, that's New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and so forth. Massive failure, right? There's no doubt about that. But you know, we tried to learn from it, and we learned that that's why we started, you know, bringing in the intercept idea, the idea of having people at festivals and fairs be there, and we've been able to do some things like working at, you know, Ag Day, up to 337 adults participating in one day, right? So far better than our 14 people. We've actually been able to expand that out. I think we had around 1,400 people participate this past month at our Ag Day in various studies at one time. So again, finding the right spot, the right teams can make a big difference there. And I think our HomeVise project has had over 2,000. So again, these become more expensive, they're bigger teams. But again, the right settings, as long as we're watching out for representativeness, right? We've got to watch out our participants, the same as other, probably not. So we got to watch out for that, maybe sample in other places as well. Again, the Department of Motor Vehicles can be a really good spot for that we've got a good relationship and can be helpful. But you know, again, we can get some interesting results from that. And if we look and take just a moment to look at that home vise project, you know, notice that the screening's still a little bit more, right? We're pushing it a bunch. Now you've got to be able to do something on your land. You know, maybe a lot of us live in complex, so it doesn't really apply to us, even if we live in a homeowners association that has strict rules, or maybe there's some landscape that's being done community. We can't have that, so you got to have some ability to take care of your own lawn. Be at least 25, so we're pushing the age up. And then we're going to, of course, like any study, we don't want them to participate more than once. But now, you know, it's not such a big problem when it's a consumer study, and they're just choosing on whether to buy clementines or not. But now they've got to be making some household choices. So, you know, maybe we're making the choices be together. Maybe it's you know, if it's a two-head of a household, they're making those choices together. Now you've got the kids running around and so forth. But we can imagine that we can test lots of different ideas. Again, our study can be $25 for a 15-minute study, so people do come in and like that, and we can test different information treatments. And so, you know, here's some work that Paul and Jacob Fuchs, who was at ERS at the time, and Tongzi Li have worked on. We can start seeing some interesting stories, right? So if we start telling people they should do these choices, what motivates people? Is it the idea that, you know, if you make choices, you are helping the environment? That's good. Or if we say, hey, you know what? If you, because you're going to continue to hurt the environment, right? So that's our positive and negative framing. And you can see just by quick glance that positive framing in those little, I don't know, candy cane, black and white, overall leads to higher willingness to pay for these products than if you kind of guilt them and say, hey, you're already hurting the environment, you better use these products or the things are just going to stay bad. That doesn't seem to be very effective at all. And we can actually see that there's also some just different willingness to pay for different items. So if we think about working with Scott's Miracle-Gro, and they're thinking about offering a new product on the market that's going to be slow release fertilizer, you know, they could see, you know, to what degree that product would be valuable in their market. You can get a lot of different information about this, and a lot of different tests that one can do. Again, I'm not going to go into all of them, but we've got lots of studies there that we can go into. But things get trickier when we start getting to farmers, right? So I'm really talking food. We've got some household decisions going on. Now let's think of framed field experiments. And the first study that I want to do, we've got this awesome, we have an app that I could show you on my iPhone. It's on iPhone and on Android, and it's on the web. And one of the things that we've been doing is working with farmers in eastern Colorado and southeast Georgia to have them voluntarily report their water usage. This is a NIFA-funded project. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is get people to upload this app, report on a monthly basis, and we send them money. We actually even send credit cards to them as part of the recruitment that then we can automatically upload, that whenever they submit a report, they get $30 more or get a chance to be in a lottery in which they can win a couple $1,000 if they were the ones that won for that time. And we can see that this is our initial letter of saying, hey, come participate. And what we're going to see over time, this is on is the idea of how many people actually signed up to participate in their research. Well, you can see that the numbers aren't going to be, it's hard to get people. And I can give you some anecdotal, we didn't design this to test it, but at one point we were worried that we weren't up to a lot of people. So Dr. Alessia Savchenko, who's here, and Maddie organized this great team that would call every person on the list of 1,500 farmers in Georgia, maybe it was 1,100, and all of that 4-day calls to individual, you know, that's right where that occurred. Sorry. You know, that is, you know, you don't have to have a counterfactual to realize that was probably a failure, right? Or definitely is a failure. If you're spending all that time, all that effort, calling every single farmer, encouraging them to sign up, and you got what, you know, 8 people signing up, that's, you know, that's an effective route to getting farmers recruited, no matter how friendly Alessia and team were. That didn't work out well. We did immediately switch into a different option where we started offering, this was sign up if you did it, we said, right, here's a special limited time offer. Well, that pushed us up a little bit. I was hoping to see maybe a doubling. But again, you see this significant challenge that happens, that how do you get farmers who are, you know, very busy people, perhaps not, you know, some of them are very busy living on the land, others are owning the and leasing it out. How do we achieve this? So that's a challenge. I'll tell you another story. Dan always liked this story. This was one of my first projects that ERS funded, and so Dan got to read my reports, but we were going out and trying to get farmers to think about water quality enhancements that they could do on their land in the Galveston Bay area. We even had a nonprofit partner, right? The Conservation Fund that I worked with a bunch, and we set up a reverse auction that we would auction these projects off, and we were going to go down into Texas, and we spent a lot of time reaching out to groups over and over again. They said, we will not send out your letter, right? We will not send your letter out recruiting people at all. And it was even, you know, at first we were trying to do, you know, working with, you know, the local land agencies or NACD or others, and they were like, nope, we're not going to do it. And then we even went to the Conservation Fund, the local office, and they said, nope, we aren't going to do it, right? And I'm like, what gives, right? We're never going to get this study done. I'm going to have to keep writing these bad reports back to Dan saying, give us more time, we're trying. And then finally they said, well, it's about Agenda 21. Agenda 21. What's, you know, that's that 1994 document from the Earth Summit. And what was that about, right? I mean, that wasn't a big deal. But, you know, it's a UN agreed upon document that came from the Earth Summit in Rio that then got released to certain kind of Tea Party groups who saw this as, you know, a hidden agenda for the United Nations, and they found out the Agenda 21, but there was Agenda 1 through 20 that were still hidden, right? And so, rallying cry about the evils of this world government coming in and causing problems, and so you saw this Agenda 21 and anything, and Agenda 21, for those people who don't know it, that's the word where the World Sustainable Development starts coming from, right? That was a conference that started putting that in the lexicon. So you mention anything about sustainability, and you get this really strong image until you start getting to the black helicopter level, where people are feeling like they're going to come in and steal the land of the farmers. And so, you know, this was a time when the Tea Party was kind of, you know, shouting down people in meetings, and this Agenda 21 thing was there. And all I was trying to do was write a study on how do farmers, you know, respond, and yet you get caught up in these other realities, right? It's no longer my lab where I've got a lot of control. I'm losing control, right? I'm losing it, and so the challenges of doing it. And what we had to do was finally say, well, we'll send them out of the University of Delaware. We can have, you know, that could be the letters. It won't be a local agency, and of course you can imagine the response rate was poor. Right? You're not going to have a lot. University of Delaware does not have much power in the Galveston area. Now maybe Texas A&M would. That'd be something to work with. But it's a challenge that happens as you move out into this field. Now, we have been successful recently with some of our, what we call our Ag-VIs, our Ag Values Innovation Stewardship Enhancement. One thing to do was to really identify a project that farmers liked. It was not water quality, whether it's in Delaware or Texas. Farmers have some mixed feelings on it. They do feel overregulated, but the idea of dealing with feral hogs was something that was more appealing, because there's a real strong on-farm problem with these feral hogs destroying crops, and yet at the same time there's some real environmental damages that are occurring as well. And so we were able to go to the Sun Belt Expo and down in Moultrie and recruit a framed field experiment. And again, note that the criteria just gets higher and higher. Now we're going to have, like, you know, they're supposed to have $1,000 in ag revenue. We're going to have a limited states. They're now at least 25 years old. But we're still able to do it. It's still hard, right? Colin spent an entire weekend, and Maddie did too, at an expo in Texas that was supposed to be great for all these farm issues, and there were 3 people who signed up, right? It was just, these are really hit or miss type of events based on the attendance there. So we were able to go and do these Sunbelt expos. Again, it's going to feel pretty external valid. You're getting a lot of farmers there, but some people can still slip in, claim they do this. We don't have a lot of enforcement. And so we don't see everyone who says they've got farm damage actually submitting a bid for these traps for cost share. And that's what we were doing, was the idea that they could make decisions on putting in a cost share into a reverse auction to get high to remove it. It was about $4,000. So they're very appealing. Farmers did like them, but it did have some limitations as well. But you get, again, some interesting results. And you can start seeing that you can use this sandbox tool to begin to test things like anchoring. And if you look at different anchoring of the bid structure for cost, you might be able to see that, hey, look, if we were able to have a low anchor, we are able to not get as many traps, deal with this problem less cost effectively than if we had a high anchor. And we can see this. We did a similar study like this at the Ag Outlook last year. So it's kind of a fun way of seeing, here's a situation where we can test some behavioral nudges. We're getting closer to the sample that we need, but recruitment still remains a challenge, not nearly as well as working with other consumer groups. Now, I'm going to talk about one more study that we did, and that is one that really brings in the idea of using a randomized controlled trial with administrative data, right? And to bring this in, because again, our costs per farmer are going to go down a lot in this situation. And this was looking at issues around histisol soils in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. These are high carbon-rich soil that tend to release large amounts of greenhouse gases. So we worked with a variety of agencies within USDA that were interested in this topic, and part of it, really was coming from the idea of mitigating climate change from an agricultural perspective. And Tom Vilsack was mentioning that at the time as something that was a priority. And yet the question is, how does USDA do this? How do they engage farmers to think about these types of soils and go forward? And especially at the same time, you're getting some literature out there saying, don't talk to farmers about climate change. If you mention the word climate change or greenhouse gases, they'll stop listening, right? So don't, and then there's a question, well, is that true or not? I mean, this is a survey that was run, but would it actually impact their decisions, or is this sort of a rejection of a survey that maybe is different than their actual decisions on the farm? And so we wanted to test this, and there were lots of competing discussions within USDA about how to do this. Could you mention the G or the C word, greenhouse gas, climate change? Is that allowed or not? Could you mailing, or did you have to have personal contact, that relationship? And so we were able to set up design to test, again, these kind of hypotheses that have been floating around agencies for a while, but there wasn't a lot of evidence that, well, is personal contact better or worse? There was not a lot of evidence, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories, a lot of beliefs, but not a strong evidence there. And then ultimately, try to link this back to actual behavior, whether that's going to learn more on a webinar, going for actual decisions at the local county office and so forth. And that's what we went forward. Now, I know this is too much information. See that we were able to set up a counterfactual by looking here and talking about, okay, here's a bunch of stuff about carbon-rich histisol soils, but we can go and just change the language subtly that one of them has discussions of greenhouse gases and climate change. Does that level of information that is would that change behavior? Or are we able to likewise go into a reminder postcard like this at the front and back side of it, and if we just put in a little bit of information about that this information is, going to have new software. Okay, there we go. Here's information that a webinar. Hey, you can learn more about this. You don't just have to read about the website. Go to a webinar. That was again something that that NRCS was very interested in promoting as a way of learning. So here's the time of the webinar, and you can do this. And we can look and do these things, you know, matter? Well, the interesting thing is to look and say, well, the results of who went to get information on websites didn't change, right? If you're looking for statistical difference, even though we got a sample of people, I think farmers too, so we had a large number of people we sent the letters to. When we look at who actually went and did things, it didn't matter whether you involved climate change language or not. Now, the overall participation rate's pretty low overall, but it didn't matter about climate change or greenhouse gases. And so, you know, that was important. However, we did find that if you started mentioning a webinar, that you scared people away from learning any information at all. There's almost an information overload. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want to go to, I want to hear a webinar, right? So people who were invited to the webinar actually were less likely to go onto websites and learn more and do things versus if they didn't get there. So again, it gives you a sense of what can you learn, what's the take-home messages. And again, that's what I think of the benefits are of these field experiments, is what can we learn from these situations and how can we do that? Because in many contexts, we're talking about participation problems, right? Whether that's in water markets, there's participation problems. Right now, CBEAR is working with the Nature Conservancy on how do we get landowners, especially those who don't work land, but maybe they live in a different state, and yet the contractors aren't people lining up to participate in programs. How do you nudge them in? We can learn about how do you do that. And so a lot of the work that we're doing now is changing incentives, doing mailers. We tried phone calls a couple times. They failed pretty badly. And do we emphasize the public good components there? There's lessons that are valuable for both researchers and program administrators. And sometimes better than to be able to go and say, we designed a good story, and it says, you know what, we designed a good study and phone calls don't work, so let's never mention them again, right? Let's learn from that versus always having this long list of potential ideas about how to reach out, and we might not be able to do it. So I'm going to talk a couple seconds just about the deepest challenges, right? And these are our Charlie Brown moments, and where we where we've struggled a bit on, and hopefully we can learn from. We've pitched dozens of ideas to USDA on research, and sometimes it's just hard to get a willing a partner. And I won't go into all the details here. I'm happy to, but there was a time in which NRCS was really interested in moving out an idea to improve the relationships with their clients, with landowners, on a client gateway and get people more engaged in it. They had a really ambitious goal of 60,000 landowners. They worked with CBEAR. We worked with Chief Weller to design, to get involved with the study, design good rollouts, get people in. And right when it was being launched, we were told, right? They decided, no, we don't want to have anything there, right? That was the football moment brought out. And yet the challenge, their concern wasn't our interventions. It was just a concern the project wasn't going to maybe launch as well as they'd hoped it to. Maybe there were some computer challenges within it that they didn't want to see have a lot of people run into. Like it took 2 days to log in the very first time and things like that. And and how did that rollout go? Well, instead of getting their 60,000 landowners in the first year, they ended up with 300 landowners in the first year, which reported the enrollment maybe is now 6,000. So they're still way below what they had hoped for. And that may be the reality. That 60,000 probably wasn't realistic in the first place. But unfortunately, by not designing it, they didn't learn anything about how you could have done it better, right? How next time you went on another client gateway or a stewardship project, how do you design it well? What's the evidence base? Football is moved out, and they're certainly learning that could and should happen. So where does this go? Where does this lessons go? And this is just one example of others. Is one is you can really find that people are really interested in this approach. I mean, Paul and I are talked with groups in the European interested in setting up CBEAR. Canadians are interested in setting up CBEAR. They like the relationship that these researchers are doing with government agencies, people like ERS, and how do we make this all work? So there's a lot of interest. I don't maybe negative on it. And we do learn important things about lab experiments, field experiments, and randomized controlled trials. But I do think that there are lessons that we need to learn here. And as we have very fertile ground from which to go from, we can begin to say, well, we've learned some things, like phone calls aren't so good, but we also need to explore more dynamic mechanisms, right? Things more than a postcard or a letter that can really move things. How do we frame incentives differently? And some of our sandbox tools can do that. It'd be great to be able to work with the agency for these things there. Another thing that we walk away knowing is that we have to remain active and engaged. And while I might be able to, point to the client gateway as a challenge of the program that's hard to overcome, I want to also talk about those same relationships that didn't work out there did lead to being asked to develop a training curriculum on conservation communication that is about using behavioral insights that will be part of NRCS staff trainings and boot camps for new staff for their roughly 10,000 trainees and field staff. So those relationships matter, but they take time, right? You got to know that this isn't a situation where researchers are in and out and are short term, get my publication and move on, that we have an active long-term engagement there. And I do think that we have to find ways in which we incentivize program administrators, either through carrots or sticks, I'm not sure which it is, or both, to participate, because these things take time, and you're going to come in and you're going to be an outside researcher, even a researcher say, hey, can you take a little time to design this? It's going to do a mailing in a different way, or design a different incentive structure. How can we do this so that we can really learn and bring back that data in a meaningful way? And how do we make sure that data is easily accessible? How do we get that access so that we can really build upon the administrative data that really only can exist in this kind of context and learn a lot? And so I'm going to and answer any questions you have. So thank you very much for your time and attention.